There are certain personalities in world history which are universally respected. One such personality would be Florence Nightingale. She was an English social reformer, statistician, and even the founder of modern nursing. But the figure we are going to discuss today, behind me, was even revered by Nightingale. Behramji Malabari was a multifaceted person and donned different hats: a social reformer, a poet, a journalist. In this episode, we are going to reconstruct his life and journey in order to understand how he contributed to the history of modern India. He was born on 18th May 1853 at Baroda in Gujarat. He was born to Dhanji Bai Mehta, who was a Parsi clerk in the Baroda state, and to Bhikhi Bai. However, the story behind this surname Malabari is a tragic one. Behramji Malabari actually lost his father at a very young age and then was raised by his stepfather, Nirvanji Nanabai Malabari. But where does this word Malabari come from? Nirvanji actually used to have a shop selling sandalwood and goods at the Malabar coast. Therefore, the name Malabari. And Behramji then inherited this unique name. After completing his education, he came to Bombay. And at a very young age, he started to serve as a teacher in the Fort Proprietary School in 1876. Malabari was, however, no ordinary learner. He was very fluent in English and Gujarati. In fact, he was the first Parsi poet to write in classical Gujarati language. His literary works are testimony to his excellence. How? Because in 1875, he wrote and published a compilation of Gujarati poems called Niti Vinod, or Pleasure of Morality. Further, in 1876, he then wrote the Indian Muse in the English garb, which then garnered praise from even Alfred Tennyson, who was a very important English poet at that point of time. His English translation of Professor Max Muller, a very important Indologist, Origin and Growth of Religion, was then published in London in 1881. More than that, he also wrote Gujarat and the Gujaratis. And in 1882, he then further wrote another important work called The Indian Eye on English Life, which was then published in 1885. So 1882, we have Gujarat and the Gujaratis, and 1885, we have The Indian Eye on the English Life. These texts are very, very important. Why? Because these texts reflect the socio-economic milieu of colonial India, and that is why they're extremely valuable to us as a source of history. Besides being a prolific writer, he was also a distinguished journalist. Malabari actually began his journalistic and editorial career after meeting with a person called Sir Koshwaji Jahangir. And Jahangir was a very important Parsi businessman. He then introduced Malabari to Martin Woods, who was the editor of the Times of India at that point of time. And then Malabari started to write in the columns of newspapers such as the Indian Spectator, an English language weekly magazine. And he then in 1880 became the editor of the Indian Spectator, which then merged in 1900 with the Voice of India. However, the connection of Voice of India with Malabari is old, because Malabari used to co-edit the Voice of India since 1883 with Sir William Wedderburn and Dadabhai Naroji. Wedderburn is very important. He's the biographer of A.O. Hume, and Dadabhai Naroji, the grand old man of India and the person who created the economic critique of colonialism in India. He also served as an editor of another monthly magazine called East and West between 1901 and 1912. Besides his extraordinary literary career, he was also a social thinker. How? Because Malabari had a firm belief that it was the Hindu priesthood which was misinterpreting the Vedas and the Upanishads. What he wanted to do was to introduce Western scholarship to the history of religion in India. And more than that, that Western education and scholarship would then be accessible to Indian scholars and clergy to open up their mind. For that, he then translated and edited a very important work of Max Muller called the Hibbert Lectures. And the Hibbert Lectures in Gujarati meant that in 1878, our own clergy and scholars had access to a very important theological work of Max Muller. More than that, It was then he brought in other magazines and books such as the Anubhavika and Admi Ane Teni Dunya to enlighten the masses about the misinterpretation of scriptures. With the conviction of social reform, he then started to write about social evils of Indian society also. And that it is important. Why? Because he then started to write about prohibiting child marriages, permitting widow remarriage. For that, Malabari even published the notes on infant marriage and enforced widowhood. Very, very important work in 1884. And what he did was he sent 4,000 copies of this work to Englishmen and Hindus to create a public opinion. In this work, Malabari criticized the social evils of child marriage and then said that we need a legislation to prevent it. However, for him, the life-changing moment came through the Bombay High Court ruling against a child bride called Rakmabai in 1885 and the death of an 11-year-old Bengali bride called Philomeni in 1889. Deeply disturbed, Malabari wrote in editorials of his own magazine. He even sent letters to the Times against the prevalent social evils. The fact is that the case aroused so much attention that even Florence Nightingale and Max Muller wrote commentaries on it. In 1890, he then published a very important book in England called An Appeal from the Daughters of India, calling for the end of social evils such as child marriage from society. Realizing that he needed to go beyond the written word, he then started in 1908 the Seva Sadan. And the Seva Sadan was there to uplift destitute women, and it was then created along with the help from his friend called Diwan Dayaram Gidumal on the model of what we call YWCA or Young Women's Christian Association. The Seva Sadan continues today to tirelessly work for the welfare and empowerment of disadvantaged girls and women. However, the most important moment or his hard work paid off when in 1891 the Age of Consent Act or Act 10 was passed by the British. What this legislation did was that it increased the age of consent from 10 to 12 for the sexual intercourse of all girls, married or unmarried, in any jurisdiction. More than that, if you were in violation of it, it meant that you will be criminally prosecuted for rape. This act was a major moral victory for Malabari. But now that we have a good understanding of his life, let's try to contextualize him in the larger history of modern India because he has a very precarious position. How do we get to know what Malabari was and where he is through his biography. In the second edition of Malabari's biography, which was then published by Dayaram Gidumal only in 1892, we have a very important preface by Florence Nightingale. And in that preface, she wrote a very important line which tells you his position. His work as a reformer of Indian social life cannot fail to set Englishmen and especially English women thinking of their duty towards their Indian brothers and sisters. This is a very important point because what she is trying to argue is that somehow Malabari was able to arouse the public opinion in England. Even when recognizing his efforts in the famine and as a social reformer, the British gave him the Kaisar-e-Hind Gold Medal in 1900. So the British also recognized his service during the famines and as a social reformer by giving him this medal. So for the British, he was seen as a very important figure. However, as a public figure, what Malabari did was he often positioned himself as a mediator. What do I mean by a mediator? A mediator between the British, who had goodwill with, and his fellow Indians in the cultural politics of late 19th century. As a result, he also faced a lot of criticism on a lot of occasions. But Malabari remained away from most of the factions and most of the organizations because he did not want the British to get some form of political vibe from him. So the conservative faction did criticize him, but the British knew that if he is not aligning himself with any of these parties, it meant that he was not a politically charged or a politically conscious person, which was important for his stance. It was this stance and this precarious legacy he had that he did not align with any political parties also or social parties. And this stopped him from receiving the love and the recognition from our history itself. More than that, the British had to make sure that Malabari was not a politically motivated person talking about nationalism. So, in the larger context, Behramji Malabari then focused on individual freedom as opposed to freedom from British, because he had goodwill with the British. And as a mediator, he needed to make sure that he did not alienate the British itself by becoming politically conscious. Though he participated in the first session of the Indian National Congress at Bombay in December 1885, his role in the larger national movement is limited. And that is why we give him invisibility, because we don't believe that he does or should get the right type of recognition. Though Malabari was accused of being a British appeaser, he stayed true to his Indian roots by then declining the knighthood which was offered to him by the Viceroy. However, this was his last act as a social reformer, because he passed away at the age of 60 on 10th July 1912 in Shimla. When we talk about his legacy and place in history, we can gauge it by the following small moment which happened in the history of modern India. Upon hearing his demise, King George V wired to Charles Hardinge, who was the Viceroy of India. And what did he wire is a very important line and shows you his importance with the British. Please convey to the family of Malabari the sincere regret with which the Queen and I have heard the death of an old friend. His death will be a loss to the country. So in the end, Behramji Malabari remains a towering figure in the history of modern India, and he should be remembered for his efforts towards women empowerment. But somehow we have given him invisibility, and we need to make sure that we recognize his efforts as a journalist, as a social reformer, and how he created the Seva Sadhan. For more videos, log on to the BYJU'S exam prep app.